My name is Ethan. I am 32 years old, an ordinary system analyst who has worked himself to the bone for years in the stuffy offices of a massive metropolis. I have always considered myself an absolute pragmatist, not prone to paranoia, mysticism, or panic attacks. I was simply looking for a bit of peace and solitude away from the hustle and bustle of the city, to live quietly and work remotely. But what I encountered in my new home completely destroyed my rational view of the world. My story begins with the fact that I always sincerely believed that moving to a classic suburb would be my absolute salvation from the endless commotion, toxic smog, and exhausting rhythm of the huge metropolis. The city was literally sucking all the life out of me, and I dreamed of silence. After long months of careful searching, my choice fell on a small, picturesque, unnamed town drowning in the dense greenery of ancient trees. It was a place that seemed to have stepped right out of perfect advertising brochures or old postcards. Perfectly even emerald lawns, neat white picket fences, friendly people who still respected each other's personal space. My new home was located on a quiet, cozy dead-end street with practically no passing traffic. The house itself was a small but very bright single-story building with a spacious wooden porch and huge panoramic windows in the living room, which, as it seemed to me then, were its main architectural feature. Directly opposite my porch, across a narrow strip of asphalt, stood an old, massive two-story house painted dark gray. Its owner was a quiet, deeply elderly man who perfectly fit the archetype of a classic retired neighbor. My interaction with him was limited to rare, polite nods in the mornings. His daily routine was scheduled by the minute. Exactly at 7 in the morning, he would step out onto the porch in an old knitted cardigan to pick up the fresh newspaper, then spend about half an hour methodically watering his beloved hydrangeas in the front garden, after which he would disappear behind the heavy oak door and show practically no signs of life until the next morning. Almost no one ever visited him, and his house always seemed like an island of absolute, unshakable silence. However, this idyll did not last long. About 2 weeks ago, I witnessed a rather sad but entirely natural event. A huge logistics company truck with a bright logo on the side pulled up to the house opposite early in the morning. As I later found out through a local information portal, the old neighbor's health had sharply deteriorated, and his relatives had decided to move the old man to a specialized medical boarding house on the distant southern coast. The move took only a few hours. Movers quickly carried out a few boxes. The massive truck left our street with a heavy hum, and the large gray house plunged into a deaf, lifeless silence. Its windows were tightly drawn with heavy, dusty drapes. The perfect lawn gradually began to overgrow with weeds, and a standard real estate agency sign appeared on the door, announcing the sale. To be honest, I was even a little glad about this turn of events, assuming that the absence of neighbors would provide me with even deeper and calmer solitude. It was the most fatal mistake of my life. The timeline of my personal madness begins last Tuesday. It was a very late, damp evening. A fine autumn rain was drizzling outside, and a thick fog slowly crept along the wet asphalt, obscuring the outlines of parked cars. I was sitting in my living room, deeply immersed in my work on the laptop. Only one dim desk lamp was lit in the room, casting long shadows on the walls. My eyes were very tired from the continuous glow of the monitor, and I decided to take a short break. I got up from my chair, stretched until my spine cracked, and walked over to that same large panoramic window just to look at the night street and give my eyes a rest. The single street lamp located on the corner of my lot dimly illuminated the area, picking out of the darkness only the wet branches of trees and the gleaming asphalt. My relaxed, wandering gaze reflexively slid over the facade of the empty house across the street and suddenly snagged dead on a second-floor window. I distinctly remembered that just that afternoon, all the curtains there had been drawn shut, without a single gap. But now, the heavy draped fabric was slightly pulled aside. From the resulting dark opening poured a very faint, unnaturally pale, flickering light, reminiscent of the cold glow of an old, broken television set. And standing motionless right in the epicenter of this dim spot was a person. My breath caught instantly, and my heart skipped a heavy, painful beat. I instinctively squinted, trying to focus my vision on this figure through the veil of rain and the glass. It was a man, incredibly tall and frighteningly morbidly thin. He was wearing some shapeless, very dark clothing that blended with the gloom of the unlit room behind him. His arms, which seemed unnaturally long, hung limply along his torso like whips. But the most terrifying, the most repulsive thing about his appearance was his face. It was turned right toward me, He was looking unblinkingly exactly at my window, despite the considerable distance between our houses. And he was smiling. This was not a normal human reaction. This smile was a grotesque grimace stretched to the absolute limit of physical possibility. His lips were pulled so wide that they exposed his gums, as if the muscles of his face had been seized by an endless, agonizing cramp in this animalistic grin. His eyes, set deep into their sockets, looked like absolutely black voids reflecting not a single gleam of light. I felt an icy drop of sweat roll down my spine. In an animal stupor, I recoiled from the cold glass and quickly drew the thick blinds, hiding behind them. My rational brain frantically tried to find a logical explanation for this. Perhaps the house had already been bought. Maybe it was one of the new owners with a weird sense of humor. But why was he standing in absolute darkness, and why did that smile seem so lifeless, so mechanical? I sat on the couch until dawn, flinching at every rustle of the old house and not daring to go near the windows again. The next morning, when bright sunlight flooded the street, I tried to convince myself that everything that had happened during the night was just the result of my chronic fatigue, a trick of the light and an overactive imagination. I brewed some strong coffee and walked over to the small kitchen window to look at the street in the daylight. And at that moment, the blood literally froze in my veins. The mug nearly slipped from my weakened fingers. In the huge first-floor window of the empty house opposite, right behind a thin layer of dusty tulle, that figure stood again. The daylight allowed me to see him with frightening clarity. This was definitely not a real estate agent or a new tenant. His gray, earthy skin seemed stretched over sharp cheekbones like dried parchment. He stood in the exact same frozen posture, arms pressed tightly to his sides, back unnaturally straight. And that smile, it hadn't changed by a single millimeter. He was still looking exactly at me. I froze, unable to tear my eyes away. A minute passed, then a second. During all this time, the figure did not move. The man's chest did not rise to the rhythm of breathing, his eyes did not blink. It looked like a terrifyingly realistic mannequin that someone had intentionally placed in the window to drive me insane. Panic overwhelmed me completely. I rushed to check all the locks on the exterior doors, tightly drew absolutely all the curtains in the house, and turned on the lights in every room, despite the clear day outside. The next few days turned into an exhausting, paranoid torture. My once safe home became a psychological prison for me. Every attempt to carefully peek out at the street through a narrow slit in the blinds ended the same way. He was always there. But the most terrifying thing was the impossible, anomalous nature of his movements. Sometimes he stood on the second floor, sometimes he appeared in the living room on the first, and once I noticed his silhouette in a tiny dormer window in the very attic, where it would be extremely difficult for a normal person to reach. Yet I never, not once, saw the actual process of him moving. If I looked away for even a fraction of a second to blink or look at the clock, he would vanish without a trace from one window and instantly appear in another. No footsteps, no flickering shadows inside the house, no creaking of old floorboards. He simply changed his location in space with a frightening instantaneousness, as if he were not a physical body, but a glitch in reality itself. Despair and lack of sleep forced me to act. I decided to approach the problem from a technical angle. I opened my laptop and connected to the outdoor video surveillance system that I had installed around the perimeter of my porch right after moving in. The two cameras had a wide viewing angle and captured not only my yard, but the entire facade of the empty house across the street. With trembling hands, I downloaded the archive of recordings for the last few days and began to carefully review them. What I discovered stripped me of the last remnants of my sanity. There was nothing on the video recordings. Absolutely nothing anomalous. The electronic lenses captured only an empty, abandoned house with blind, dark windows. No pale light at night, no figures behind the glass. The cameras showed the absolutely normal reality of an abandoned building. But as soon as I lifted my inflamed eyes from the monitor and looked out my window, he was standing there again, in the house opposite, and his inhuman smile stretched even wider. This entity, whatever it was, existed exclusively for my perception. The digital matrices simply didn't see it. The climax of this madness occurred last night. Meteorologists had warned of an impending severe storm, and they were not wrong. Closer to midnight, a furious thunderstorm struck our neighborhood. Squally winds howled terribly, bending the crowns of the trees. Heavy streams of water crashed onto the roof of my house, and frequent flashes of lightning tore through the darkness, accompanied by deafening claps of thunder that made the walls shake. Due to a downed power line, the entire block plunged entirely into darkness. I sat on the cold floor in the narrow hallway, hugging my knees tightly, praying only that the night would end as soon as possible. The roar of the elements outside was so strong it felt like the house would simply fall apart. But at some point, the wind abruptly died down. The rain stopped drumming against the glass. A dense, unnatural, vacuum-like silence fell. And that was when I heard it. A quiet, methodical, rhythmic knocking. It was coming from outside, right at my heavy front door. I stopped breathing, my muscles cramped with terror. Slowly, trying not to make a sound, I crawled on all fours to the narrow vertical glass panel located beside the door frame. I didn't want to look, but my survival instinct demanded to know what was outside the door. Another blinding flash of lightning illuminated the street for a fraction of a second with cold, electric light. He was no longer in the house across the street. He was standing right on my lawn, just 2 meters from the steps of my porch. His dark clothing was soaked through from the recent downpour and clung heavily to his unnaturally skinny, angular body. And he was smiling in a way that no living creature can smile. Now, from such a close distance, I could make out this abomination in detail. His mouth was ripped almost to his very ears, exposing rows of small, yellowed, sharp teeth, far too many of them. The skin on his face was gray and covered in deep cracks, like parched earth. In his wide-open eyes, there were no whites, only an impenetrable, sucking blackness, just looking at which made me physically nauseous. I let out a stifled cry and crawled backward down the hallway. The knocking on the door stopped, but it was replaced by another sound, one that caused my nerves to finally snap. It was a continuous, agonizingly slow scraping. Someone was dragging something very sharp and hard across the glass outside. The sound began to move. The scraping sounded at the living room window, then slowly moved to the kitchen window, and then reached the bedroom. This creature was leisurely circling my house, leaving invisible tracks on the glass with its claws. In a panic, I rushed into the first-floor bathroom, the only room without windows, locked the door with the heavy deadbolt, huddled in the corner of the shower cabin, and sat there until dawn with my hands clamped over my ears. In the morning, when the first rays of sunlight broke through the cracks, I carefully left my sanctuary. There was absolutely no physical damage or scratching on the glass outside. The wet earth around the house retained not a single footprint or shoe mark. But I know exactly what happened during the night. My mind is not yet so damaged as to be unable to distinguish reality from hallucinations. Right now, I am sitting on the floor in the middle of the living room, frantically stuffing passports, my laptop, and a change of clothes into a travel bag. I will not stay here for another second. I am going to the very center of the city. I'll rent a room in the most crowded and brightly lit hotel on the highest floor. I have already called a taxi, and the app shows that the car is approaching my street. But a few minutes ago, I made my final monstrous mistake. I couldn't resist, and looked out the window to check if the car had arrived. In the first-floor window of the empty house, he was standing again. But now he wasn't motionless. His long, pale hand slowly, mockingly rose upward, and began to wave at me in farewell. His terrifying smile pulsed, and his bloodless lips continuously, soundlessly moved. I didn't need to know how to read lips to understand what exactly he was saying. Over and over again, without stopping, he was soundlessly enunciating my name. My life had turned into a continuous, protracted nightmare long before the events of that night occurred. The reason for this was severe, clinical insomnia. I lived in an old brick building in a rainy city. My apartment was on the 3rd floor, and its main feature was the placement of the windows. They didn't face a busy avenue, but rather a narrow, dark alley, on the opposite side of which stood a private 2-story house. The distance between the brick wall of my building and the wooden facade of the neighboring house was no more than 15 meters. Due to the lack of normal sleep, my schedule had completely shifted. The days merged into one gray mass, and the nights seemed endless. The only way to somehow relieve the growing anxiety was the habit of smoking by the open window in the kitchen. Every night, from about 2 to 4 in the morning, I sat on the wide windowsill in complete darkness, inhaling the freezing night air and watching the sleeping city. The house opposite was always plunged into darkness. Its owner seemed like an absolutely ordinary, inconspicuous middle-aged clerk. He would leave in his unremarkable sedan every morning exactly at 8 and return by 6 in the evening. No parties, no guests, no deviations from the schedule. On that particular night, the weather was disgusting. A fine, stinging rain was falling, and the wind swayed the old street lamps, making the shadows on the wet asphalt twitch convulsively. The clock read about 3:30 in the morning. I was sitting by the open window, leaning halfway out into the street, smoking my third cigarette of the night. Not a single light source was on in my apartment. Suddenly, in the house opposite on the ground floor, which consisted of a spacious living room with huge French windows, a sharp, cold light flashed on. My gaze mechanically focused on the illuminated rectangle of the stranger's window. I wasn't planning on spying on anyone. It was a purely reflex reaction to a sudden stimulus in the pitch black. The blinds in the living room were pulled all the way up. What was happening inside immediately triggered a feeling of deep, primal discomfort. The owner of the house was in a state of extreme agitation. He was rushing around the room, his movements sharp, jerky, devoid of his usual daytime measured pace. He was dressed in dark clothes and long yellow rubber gloves. The kind usually used for handling harsh chemicals clearly stood out on his hands. I froze, stopping mid-drag on my cigarette. My breathing became shallow. The neighbor disappeared into the depths of the hallway, falling out of my field of vision, and reappeared a couple of minutes later. This time he moved slowly, with visible physical effort. He was dragging a massive, shapeless load across the parquet floor, tightly wrapped in blue construction tarp and bound with a thick layer of silver duct tape. The shape and dimensions of this bundle evoked blood-chilling associations that my exhausted brain refused to accept as reality. The load hit the leg of a coffee table with a dull thud. The owner of the house sharply yanked the bundle toward himself, dragging it into the center of the room. At that moment, part of the blue tarp caught on the sharp corner of the furniture and tore. A dark, thick liquid began to slowly seep onto the light wooden parquet, forming an expanding puddle. The neighbor's panic became tangible even across the meters of the night street separating us. He dropped his load, rushed into the next room, and returned with a plastic bucket, a mop, and a large bottle of industrial bleach. He generously poured the chemical straight onto the floor, dropped to his knees, and began to scrub the dark stain frantically, with animalistic fury, smearing the foam across the parquet. I sat by my window, my back pressed hard against the window frame. My body went numb. The blood pounded in my temples so hard that the sound drowned out the noise of the rain. I realized I had become a witness to something monstrous. My brain screamed at the need to immediately step away from the window, hide, crawl under the bed, but my muscles refused to obey. And then I made the most terrible mistake of my life. Due to the incredible nervous tension, completely unconsciously, I took a deep, long drag. The tip of my cigarette flared with a bright, ruby-red light in the absolute darkness of my apartment. This tiny ember in the dark window of the third floor became a kind of beacon. In the living room opposite, the man suddenly froze. His hands, gripping the sponge with bleach, stopped halfway. He slowly straightened up, still kneeling in the puddle of chemicals. Then his head began to turn. He turned exactly toward my building. He was looking for the source of the red flash. His gaze swept across the facade until it stopped right on my open window. At that moment, our eyes met. I couldn't see the details of his face because of the distance and the rain, but I physically felt that dead, cold, piercing stare. He realized the window was open. He realized someone was sitting there. He realized he had been watched from the very beginning. We stared at each other for a long 10 seconds. No one moved. The air between our houses seemed to thicken, turning into a viscous, suffocating mass. Then the neighbor slowly, never taking his eyes off my window, reached out to the wall and turned off the light in the living room. The house opposite plunged into impenetrable darkness, but this darkness was filled with a tangible, deadly threat. The adrenaline finally broke through the numbness in my body. I dropped the cigarette on the floor, dropped to all fours, and crawled away from the window. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely coordinate my movements. I crawled across the kitchen floor, reached the front door of my apartment, and turned all 3 locks with trembling fingers, then slipped the heavy metal chain on. I didn't call the police. My fear-paralyzed brain generated only thoughts that I had no proof, that the dispatcher would ask questions, that the sirens would scare him off but not stop him. All my survival instincts boiled down to one thing: survive the next few minutes. I backed into the bedroom, felt under the bed for the heavy baseball bat I had bought at a flea market many years ago, and huddled in the darkest corner of the hallway, from where I could see the gap under the front door. 5 minutes passed. The building was absolutely silent. I started to convince myself that he had just gotten scared and was now panicking, trying to get rid of the evidence in his own house. And then down below, on the ground floor of my stairwell, came the quiet, metallic click of the front door. My heart stopped. The entrance door to the stairwell was equipped with a combination lock, but that lock had been broken for several months. Anyone could walk in. After the click, there was silence. No sound of footsteps, no hum of voices. Just absolute, dead silence. But I knew someone was down there. A minute later, I heard the first sound on the stairs. It was the barely perceptible creak of an old wooden step on the flight between the first and second floors. Whoever was coming up was doing so with a terrifying, calculated caution. He was shifting his body weight slowly, trying not to make a sound. The sounds were getting louder. The footsteps passed the second floor and started coming up to mine, the third. I stopped breathing. My fingers turned white from the force with which I gripped the handle of the wooden bat. Cold sweat rolled down my face, getting into my eyes, but I didn't dare even blink. The footsteps stopped on the landing of my floor. The strip of light from the hallway, shining through the crack under my front door, was suddenly blocked by two dark shadows. Someone was standing right on the other side, 10 centimeters from my face. I could hear his breathing, the slow, deep, controlled breathing of a predator tracking its prey. Then the door handle of my apartment began to turn very slowly. The metal scraped quietly. The handle went all the way down, hitting the mechanism of the locked lock. A heavy weight leaned against the door, testing the strength of the steel deadbolts. The wood creaked menacingly under the pressure, but the locks held. The pressure stopped. The shadow under the door didn't disappear for about another hour. For that entire hour, I sat on the floor, unable to move, preparing for the door to fly off its hinges at any second. Eventually, the shadows vanished, and I heard the same slow, careful footsteps heading back down the stairs. I didn't leave the apartment for 3 days. I sat in the dark, flinching at every sound, until I finally called a team of movers in the middle of the day. I left that neighborhood and never returned. The police never arrested anyone. I don't know what was in that bundle, and I don't know what happened to that neighbor. But I know one thing for sure. Since then, I never go near windows after dark. And I quit smoking a long time ago.